Hello, BookTube. I've got a bit of a response video here to the latest offerings from the redoubtable Joe Spivey. I will leave a link to his video down below. He gives a brief chat about the chunk of Peter Ackroyd's biography of William Shakespeare that he has read. And in the video, he strongly implies that it's just not good enough for him to continue, and that he's not really thinking about moving on to another Ackroyd after this. It's not doing anything for him. And I thought this merited a brief response on two fronts. One is the absolute heresy of that. On behalf of workaday hacks like myself and Peter Ackroyd and Clive James, I have to stick up for him as a writer. He is a very entertaining writer. I don't think he's Joe Spivey's type of writer. Joe Spivey strikes me, despite all of the reluctance that he might be feeling, he strikes me very much more as in the group of Will Self, Martin Amis, that sort of thing. That group of people, the smart set with the long hair and whatnot. Peter Ackroyd is much more the writer of, well, I'm going to sit down and write this thing. I'm going to make it entertaining to everybody at the fish and chips shop down at the end of the street. I have to speak up once the ear-piercing siren is over, that is. We'll just wait for that to happen. Once again, for those of you who might be new to the channel and might be a little soft-hearted, do not be alarmed. There is no emergency. There is no emergency. This is a very long, very straight road with plenty of stoplights. And if you run a siren, you can run through a stoplight. That's the only reason. That's the only reason that you hear this in literally every video that I make. 10,000 videos. Literally every one. Is because these jabrones don't want to sit at a red light. That's all. That's the only reason they do it. There are no emergencies. But anyway, I wanted to respond to Joe Spivey's video in two ways. First, I want to stick up for Peter Ackroyd. That's all. I want to encourage Joe to read another Peter Ackroyd. He mentions, for instance, Ackroyd's great biography of Charles Dickens. And is looking at it askance now, wondering if maybe this author just isn't for him. But the second thing I want to echo is, I think, the main source of his frustration with Peter Ackroyd's life of William Shakespeare, which is that it doesn't take you more than a dozen pages, let alone 200 pages, to realize that what Peter Ackroyd is doing, that he absolutely does not do in his biography of Charles Dickens, that he doesn't do in any of his other books, which is to suppose, to guess on page after page after page, paragraph after paragraph after paragraph. Well, we don't really know that this happened to Shakespeare. Well, we can informedly guess it. Well, we're not really sure where Shakespeare was at this time, but it seems pretty likely that he was. Now, if you're writing a biography of somebody from 400 or 500 years ago, of course you're going to do something like that. Of course that's going to crop up. That crops up no matter what. Biographies of Elizabeth I do that. But all the time, page after page after page, the minute you become aware of it, you suddenly can't unsee it. You suddenly realize how often it's happening. In a 500-page biography of William Shakespeare, you realize that most of it is that. Okay, this play of William Shakespeare's is full of insider chat about heraldry. So this is a perfect opportunity, either in the main text or in the footnote to this chapter, for you, the author, to explain where that comes from. Where does that come from? You want to if you get to a section of a Christopher Marlowe play and the characters start swapping puns on classical Greek literature, well, either in the text of that biography or in the footnote to that chapter, you as a writer are going to talk about Marlowe's education. We're going to talk about where he went to school, when he went to school, and what the curriculum was like there. And we know that he was there because, we have attendance records, or conspicuously the lack thereof, where he was in danger of not getting his degree, and the college had to be written to by the Queen, which she would not do to someone who had not gone to that college. That in the footnotes to that chapter, that's where you'll talk about that. When you get to classical badinage between two characters, something that would come from a university education, that's where you'll get it. you get to a part in a Shakespeare play where characters are talking about the extreme specifics of heraldry, and the chapter will be completely silent on that, and the endnotes will be full of the locutions that Joe Spivey was mentioning. It seems likely that, or one good supposition would be, because Shakespeare was the son of a glove maker in Stratford-on-Avon, with no court connections of any kind, and maybe was an actor or connected with a theatrical group. He would never know any of that stuff. There were no libraries in Shakespeare's day. He wouldn't know any of that stuff. You could say, the footnotes to that section might say, well, but we know that his patron was the Earl of Southampton, who was very much connected to that world. Okay, but do we know that Southampton was Shakespeare's patron? He dedicates a couple of poems to Southampton. Do we know that that makes him Shakespeare's patron? Did they ever meet? Did they ever exchange money? Did Shakespeare ever go to any of Southampton's homes? Does he ever say that Southampton is his patron? No, none of that. Does Southampton ever mention it? That the most famous playwright of the day is in his gift? No, he doesn't. Is there anything to connect the two of them other than the dedication of a couple of poems? No, there isn't. If there were, would that be enough to suppose that Southampton sat down over what, Malmsey, and talked with this poet from Warwickshire about heraldry? No, it's not enough to assume that at all. There's some doubt among some linguists, I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, there's some doubt among some linguists of the period whether or not the Earl of Southampton would have been able to understand Shakespeare with his regional accent. Certainly it wouldn't have been easy. And Shakespeare wouldn't have been anybody who would have been invited to dinner with the Earl of Southampton under any circumstances. Seems pretty unlikely, then, that would have been the route of transmission. And what other routes are there? You have to suppose them. You can't produce them. You have to suppose them. And so on down the line. Where did Shakespeare, William Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon, get the money to buy the enormous house that he bought in Stratford? We know that he bought it. And we know that he conducted business in Stratford. The normal narrative of his life, Peter Ackroyd apes that normal narrative, will say that he wasn't doing that business. For 20 years he was writing in London. So where did he get the money to do that? After a while, reading a book, I think that Peter Ackroyd's Life of William Shakespeare is wonderful. It makes for wonderful reading from start to finish. I don't know what's wrong with Joe Spivey, but then none of us do. But I think it makes wonderful reading from beginning to end. But you have to acknowledge, no matter where you stand on the so-called Shakespeare authorship controversy, you have to acknowledge that when you're reading it, you are over and over again barking your shin on the fact that the author is making most of it up. And that wouldn't be true. With even a biography of Cicero, that wouldn't be true. That ought to strike you as odd. You are not a tinfoil hat, they're making the frogs gay conspiracy theorist if you think that's odd. That is legitimately odd. That does not happen with anyone else writing in Shakespeare's London. Nothing even close to it does. So I thought I'd make both those points, that I would both stick up for Joe Spivey and damn him to the deepest pits of hell, which he's familiar with. He's familiar with that all or nothing twofold response to him. I wholeheartedly agree with him that after a while, this becomes so persistent in a narrative life of Shakespeare that you kind of wait for the author to notice it themselves and talk about it, and the well-behaved ones never do. The ones that know what side of the bread there is buttered on, they don't ever say, perhaps you've noticed. You'd expect somebody like Clive James or Peter Ackroyd or whoever to reach page 200 and then stop, turn to the reader and say, perhaps you've noticed that I'm mostly supposing here. I'm mostly guessing. Let's talk about that a little bit. They never do. They never do. They don't want to be tarred as weird conspiracy theorists who think that Shakespeare didn't write the plays that bear his name. So they don't address the fact that if you're reading one of these lives as you're totally on board with the national mythology of Shakespeare. You could be totally on board with it. If you're reading it with any kind of critical attention, after no more than 200 pages, you're going to realize, okay, when's the last time that you wrote something in this life of Shakespeare that is actually a fact that is known about Shakespeare? I can't remember the last time. I'm paging back. It's all this circumlocution of, we can probably guess, or we can be reasonably sure, over and over again in the course of the book. All of them, not just Peter Ackroyd. if you're reading this thing with any kind of distance, you will see that right away. It's unavoidable. So, A, Joe Spivey's right to notice that. And B, Joe Spivey's wrong to condemn my fellow lowbrow scribbler. Lowbrow scribblers are the thing that makes the bookish world go round. They can't all be sesquipedalian wonders like Joe Spivey. So I wanted you to agree. If you watch this video, I'll leave it linked down below. I want you to agree that he has a point, and also disagree. And actually, I want to know how many of you are Peter Ackroyd fans. I'm assuming that some of you have read his work. He's sold a ton of books. Do you enjoy him, typically? Have any of you read his fiction? Be curious to know. But anyway, that's my response to Joe Spivey. I just thought I'd air my grievances, but I will wrap this up for now. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.